The night was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the whole world is asleep except for you. The only sound came from the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional chirping of crickets outside. Chuck Norris sat in his favorite chair, a worn-out leather recliner that had been with him through years of adventures and quiet evenings alike. He was reading a book about old westerns, something he enjoyed when he wanted to relax. But just as he turned the phone rang. Chuck glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Nobody called at this hour unless it was important or strange. He put the book down and reached for the phone, his curiosity piqued. "Hello?" he said, his voice calm but firm, the way it always was, on down. The other end of the line there was a shaky breath before someone spoke. "Chuck, it's me, Clint." The voice was unmistakable. It belonged to Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director. But something was off. His tone was unsteady, almost broken. Chuck frowned. This wasn't the Clint Eastwood he knew, the tough, no-nonsense man who always seemed untouchable. "Clint? What's wrong?" Chuck asked, leaning forward in his chair. He could hear Clint breathing heavily, as if he were trying to hold back tears. For a moment, there was silence, and Chuck wondered if the call had dropped. Then Clint finally spoke. "I don't know what to do anymore," Clint said, his voice trembling. "I've been carrying this weight for so long. I can't take it anymore." Chuck's brow furrowed. He had known Clint for years, and while they weren't best friends, they respected each other deeply. This wasn't like him. Whatever was bothering Clint must have been serious. "Slow down," Chuck said gently. "Tell me what's going on." There was another pause, and then Clint began to explain. His words came out in bursts, sometimes clear, sometimes muffled by emotion. He talked about a secret he had kept hidden for decades, a secret so painful that it had eaten away at him over the years. He didn't give many details, but he made it clear that it involved something terrible from his past, something he felt responsible for. By the time he finished speaking, Chuck could hear the raw pain in his voice. "I need your help, Chuck," Clint said, his tone desperate. "Can you meet me? There's a cabin, an old one, deep in the woods outside Los Angeles. I'll be there at dawn." Chuck hesitated for a moment. He didn't know what exactly Clint was dealing with, but he could tell it was serious. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be there." After hanging up, Chuck stared at the phone for a long time. His mind raced with questions. What could possibly make Clint Eastwood break down like that? And why did he want to meet at such an odd location? Something about the whole situation felt uneasy, but Chuck couldn't ignore the plea in Clint's voice. If his old friend needed him, he would be there. Across town in a small apartment filled with stacks of newspapers and notebooks, Laura Bennett was wide awake. She wasn't used to sleeping much anyway, not since she became a journalist. Her job was to dig into stories others overlooked, and she prided herself on finding the truth no matter how hard it was to uncover. That night, however, her insomnia led her to check her email one last time before bed. As she scrolled through her inbox, one message caught her eye. The subject line read, "Clint Eastwood acting strange lately." Laura clicked on the email. It was short and vague, written by someone who refused to reveal their identity. The sender claimed to have seen Clint behaving oddly in public recently, canceling appearances, avoiding interviews, and even looking visibly upset during a charity event. At first glance, it didn't seem like much. Celebrities often went through phases where they stepped back from the spotlight. But something about the timing of the email made Laura curious. Why send it now in the middle of the night? She decided to look into it. Pulling up her laptop, she started searching for recent news articles or social media posts about Clint. Sure enough, there were rumors floating around online about him acting differently. Some fans speculated that he might be sick, while others thought he was simply taking a break. But none of these explanations felt satisfying to Laura. She had learned over the years that when things didn't add up, there was usually a bigger story lurking beneath the surface. As she continued her research, Laura stumbled upon an old article from years ago. It mentioned an accident on the set of one of Clint's movies, a tragedy that had been quickly swept under the rug. The details were sparse, but the name of a young woman stood out: Emily Dawson. According to the article, she had been a production assistant who died under mysterious circumstances. At the time, the incident was ruled an accident, but Laura noticed subtle hints in the wording that suggested otherwise. Her instincts kicked in. Could this be connected to Clint's current behavior? Was there more to Emily Dawson's death than met the eye? Laura grabbed a pen and jotted down notes, already planning her next steps. She didn't know it yet, but her investigation would lead her straight to the heart of Clint's secret, and to the cabin where he and Chuck were about to have a life-changing conversation. Back at his ranch, Chuck tried to get some rest, but sleep eluded him. He kept replaying Clint's voice in his head, the desperation in his words. Whatever was waiting for him at the cabin, he knew it wouldn't be easy. But Chuck had faced tough situations before, both in real life and in his storied career. If anyone could handle whatever Clint was going through, it was him. By the time the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, Chuck was already dressed and ready to go. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, the familiar rumble, grounding him. As he drove toward the meeting spot, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day would change everything, for Clint, for himself, and maybe even for others whose lives had been touched by whatever secrets lay buried in the past. The road stretched ahead of him, winding through dense forests and rolling hills. The cabin was still miles away, but Chuck's mind was racing faster than the truck's wheels. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was just beginning to rise as Chuck Norris pulled his truck into a clearing near the cabin. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their songs blending with the gentle rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the weight of the situation that had brought him here. Chuck stepped out of the truck, stretching his legs after the long drive. He glanced around, taking in the quiet surroundings. The cabin itself was small and weathered, its wooden walls grayed by time and neglect. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, signaling that Clint was already inside. Chuck walked up to the door and knocked firmly. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing Clint Eastwood standing there. His face looked tired, the lines etched deeper than usual, and his eyes were red-rimmed. For a man who always seemed larger than life, he appeared unusually fragile. "Thanks for coming," Clint said quietly, stepping aside to let Chuck in. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a couch covered in a patchwork quilt, and shelves lined with old books and knickknacks. Clint gestured toward one of the chairs. "Sit down," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Chuck nodded and took a seat, watching as Clint poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. He handed one to Chuck before sitting across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional snap of wood in the fireplace. Finally, Clint sighed deeply and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, staring into the flames. Chuck sipped his coffee, waiting patiently. He knew this wasn't going to be easy for Clint, and he didn't want to rush him. "It's okay," Chuck said gently. "Take your time." Clint nodded, gathering his thoughts. When he finally began to speak, his words came haltingly at first, as if he were trying to find the right way to say something he'd kept buried for years. "Do you remember that movie I shot in Montana?" he asked, glancing at Chuck. "It was, 30 years ago?" Chuck thought for a moment. "Yeah, I think so. Wasn't it that Western, the one with all the horseback riding scenes?" "That's the one," Clint confirmed. "It was supposed to be my big comeback picture, the kind of film that would remind everyone why they loved me. But instead," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Instead, it became something else entirely." Chuck frowned, sensing the gravity of Clint's tone. "What happened?" Clint hesitated, gripping his coffee mug tightly. "There was a girl," he said finally. "Her name was Emily Dawson. She worked on the set as a production assistant. Bright kid, smart, ambitious, full of dreams. Everyone liked her." He paused, swallowing hard. "But she was also outspoken, always asking questions, pointing out things that weren't right. Safety issues, mostly. We were shooting in some pretty rough terrain and she kept saying the conditions weren't safe enough. People ignored her, of course. They thought she was being dramatic or overcautious." Chuck listened intently, his expression unreadable. He could tell Clint was struggling to get the words out, but he didn't interrupt. This was Clint's story to tell. "One night," Clint continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was a storm. A bad one. The crew was working late. Because we were behind schedule and no one wanted to lose another day, Emily was helping secure equipment when it happened." He stopped, closing his eyes as if trying to block out the memory. "She slipped, fell from a platform. By the time anyone got to her, it was too late." The room fell silent. Chuck stared at Clint, absorbing the weight of what he'd just heard. "That's terrible," he said after a moment. "But accidents happen, Clint. You can't blame yourself for every tragedy." Clint shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I tried to help her, I really did, but I froze. I saw her fall and I just stood there like a coward." He slammed his fist against the table, startling Chuck. "And then, after it was over, they covered it up, called it an accident, swept it under the rug like it didn't matter, but it did matter, Chuck. It mattered to her family, to her friends, to me." Chuck leaned back in his chair, processing everything Clint had said. He could see the guilt written all over his friend's face, the years of torment, the shame of not speaking up. It was clear that this wasn't just about an accident. It was about accountability, responsibility, and the burden of keeping secrets. "Why are you telling me this now?" Chuck asked softly. "After all these years?" Clint sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Because I can't carry it anymore," he admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her face. Every award I win, every applause I get, it feels hollow. Like I don't deserve any of it. I need to make things right, Chuck. I owe her that much." Before Chuck could respond, headlights suddenly pierced through the windows, illuminating the room. Both men turned toward the source, startled. Whoever it was, they hadn't expected company. Clint stood up quickly, his body tense. "Who's that?" he muttered, moving toward the window. Outside, a car pulled into the clearing. The engine cut off, and a figure emerged from the driver's side. It was a woman, dressed in a dark coat, and holding a notebook. Her sharp eyes scanned the area before landing on the cabin. Without hesitation, she started walking toward the door. Clint cursed under his breath. "Who is she?" he demanded, looking at Chuck. Chuck shrugged, equally confused. "I don't know, but she looks like trouble." A few seconds later, there was a knock at the door. Clint hesitated, then opened it cautiously. The woman stood there, her expression determined. "Mr. Eastwood?" she asked, her voice steady. "My name is Laura Bennett. I'm a journalist. I need to talk to you." Clint's jaw tightened. "About what?" Laura held up her notebook. "About Emily Dawson." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Clint exchanged a glance with Chuck, who gave him a subtle nod of reassurance. Whatever was about to happen next, they would face it together. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the cabin was heavy, almost suffocating. Clint stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Laura Bennett as if she were a ghost from his past. Her presence felt intrusive, like she had somehow peeled back the layers of his carefully guarded life and exposed the raw wound beneath. Chuck, sitting quietly by the fire, watched the exchange with a mix of curiosity and unease. He could see the tension in Clint's posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Laura didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside, brushing past Clint without hesitation. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the cozy but worn interior. "I'm sorry to barge in like this," she said, her tone calm but firm, "but I think you know why I'm here." Clint closed the door behind her, his mind racing. How much did she know? Had someone tipped her off about Emily Dawson? Or was this just another journalist chasing rumors? Either way, he couldn't let her dig too deep. Not yet. Not until he figured out how to handle the situation. "You've got some nerve showing up unannounced," he said, trying to sound intimidating. But his voice lacked its usual authority, betraying the turmoil brewing inside him. Laura ignored the comment and turned to face him. "I've been looking into something," she began, pulling out a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. "A story about an accident on one of your movie sets years ago. A young woman named Emily Dawson died. Does that ring a bell?" Chuck tensed, watching Clint's reaction closely. The older man's face went pale, his jaw tightening as if he were clenching his teeth. For a moment it seemed like he might deny everything, shut Laura down, or even throw her out. But then, unexpectedly, he sighed and sank into a chair by the table. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It rings a bell." Laura studied him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Good. Then maybe you can help me fill in the gaps, because what I've found so far doesn't add up." Clint glanced at Chuck, who gave him a subtle nod. If they wanted to get through this, they needed to cooperate, at least for now. "What do you want to know?" Clint asked reluctantly. Laura sat down across from him, placing her notebook on the table. "Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened that night." For the next hour, Clint recounted the events leading up to Emily's death. His words were slow and deliberate, as if each sentence carried the weight of years of guilt. He talked about the dangerous conditions on set, the pressure to meet deadlines, and Emily's repeated warnings that went unheeded. He described the stormy night when she fell, the chaos that followed, and the hasty investigation that labeled her death an accident. By the time he finished, his voice was hoarse, and his hands were trembling. Laura listened intently, jotting down notes, but never interrupting. When Clint finally fell silent, she leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "And after that?" she asked. "What happened to her family? To the people who worked on the set?" Clint hesitated, glancing at Chuck again. This part of the story was harder to tell, not because he didn't remember, but because it reminded him of how complicit he'd been in covering things up. Her brother, Matthew, he tried to fight back, Clint admitted. He accused the production company of negligence, demanded answers, but no one listened. They paid him off, made him sign a non-disclosure agreement, and swept the whole thing under the rug. Laura frowned, her pen hovering over the page. "That's not uncommon, unfortunately," she said. "But there's more to it than that." "Isn't there?" "Something you're not telling me." Clint flinched, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. "What makes you say that?" "Because accidents don't leave people feeling guilty for decades," Laura replied evenly. "And they certainly don't bring legends like you to tears in the middle of the night. So, what is it, Mr. Eastwood? What are you really hiding?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Clint looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He knew he couldn't keep running from the truth. Not anymore. With a shaky breath, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Emily," he said, sliding it across the table toward Laura. "She kept it during the shoot. Wrote down everything, her thoughts, her fears, even complaints about the unsafe conditions. After she died, I took it. Kept it all these years, thinking it would ease my conscience, but it didn't." Laura picked up the journal, her fingers tracing the worn cover. It was clear that this wasn't just a random item. It was evidence. A piece of Emily's life that had been hidden away for far too long. "May I?" she asked, looking at Clint. He nodded, though his expression was pained. "Go ahead. Maybe you'll find something I missed." As Laura flipped through the pages, Chuck moved closer, peering over her shoulder. The entries were written in neat handwriting, filled with details about Emily's daily struggles and hopes for the future. Some passages described her frustration with the lack of safety measures, while others expressed her love for filmmaking and her dream of becoming a producer someday. But one entry stood out. A paragraph where Emily mentioned being harassed by a senior crew member. She wrote about feeling trapped, unsure of whom to trust, and afraid of losing her job if she spoke up. "This is it," Laura whispered, her voice tinged with excitement. "This changes everything." "What do you mean?" Chuck asked, frowning. "This isn't just about negligence," Laura explained. "It's about abuse of power, about systemic problems in the industry that have been ignored for too long. If we can prove what happened to Emily and connect it to broader issues, we might be able to spark real change." Clint stared at her, his heart pounding. He hadn't considered the bigger picture before. He'd only thought about his own guilt, his own failures. But now, hearing Laura talk about exposing the truth, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Emily's death wouldn't be in vain after all. Determined to uncover the full story, Laura decided to travel to Montana, where the film had been shot. She hoped to track down former crew members and gather first-hand accounts of what had happened. Before leaving, she promised Clint and Chuck that she would handle the information responsibly, ensuring that Emily's memory was honored. In Montana, Laura visited the small town where the production had taken place. Many of the locals still remembered the tragedy, though few were willing to talk about it openly. After days of searching, she finally tracked down Daniel Harper, a retired cameraman who had worked on the film. Over coffee at a local diner, Daniel confirmed much of what Clint had told her. He spoke about the unsafe working conditions, the pressure to cut corners, and Emily's courage in speaking out despite the risks. "She was brave," Daniel said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Braver than any of us. We should have listened to her, but we didn't. And now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Now it's too late." Laura pressed him for more details, asking if anyone had tried to address the issues after Emily's death. Daniel hesitated, then revealed that Emily had written letters to industry regulators detailing her concerns. However, those letters mysteriously disappeared after the accident, along with other evidence that could have implicated the production company. By the time Laura returned to Los Angeles, she had enough material to write a groundbreaking exposé. But she knew that publishing the story wouldn't be easy. Powerful people would try to stop her, and the backlash could be overwhelming. Still, she was determined to see it through. For Emily, for her family, and for everyone else who had suffered, in silence. When she met with Clint and Chuck again, she showed them her draft. They read it together, their faces etched with emotion. For Clint, it was a chance to confront his demons and seek redemption. For Chuck, it was a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And for Laura, it was proof that the truth, no matter how painful, has the power to heal. As they prepared to go public with the story, none of them knew exactly what lay ahead. But one thing was certain. The world was about to learn the truth behind Emily Dawson's death, and the impact would ripple far beyond Hollywood. The decision to go public with the story was not made lightly. Clint Eastwood, Chuck Norris, and Laura Bennett spent hours discussing the best way to release the information. They knew that once it was out, there would be no turning back. The truth about Emily Dawson's death and the negligence and abuse of power surrounding it would become a national conversation. For Clint, this meant exposing his own role in the tragedy, something he had avoided for decades. But deep down, he understood that staying silent any longer would only compound his guilt. "I don't care what happens to me," Clint said one evening as they sat around the table in the cabin. "If this helps bring justice for Emily, then I'll do whatever it takes." His voice was firm, though his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee mug. Over the past few days, he had opened up more than ever before, sharing details about his struggles with guilt and regret. It was clear that carrying the secret for so long had taken its toll on him. Chuck nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. "You're doing the right thing, Clint. This isn't just about you, it's about making sure no one else has to suffer like Emily did." He glanced at Laura, who was organizing her notes and preparing for the next steps. "We'll stand by you every step of the way." Laura looked up from her notebook, her eyes filled with determination. "This is bigger than all of us," she said. "It's about holding people accountable and creating change. But we need to be smart about how we handle it. There will be pushback, and we have to be ready." With their plan solidified, Laura reached out to Emily's family, particularly her brother Matthew Dawson. She explained everything she had uncovered: the unsafe working conditions, the harassment Emily endured, and the cover-up that followed her death. At first, Matthew was hesitant to trust her. Years of frustration and unanswered questions had left him bitter and wary of outsiders. But when Laura showed him Emily's journal and shared Clint's confession, something shifted in him. This is what I've been waiting for," Matthew said, his voice choked with emotion. He clutched the journal tightly, tears streaming down his face. "For years I've wanted someone to acknowledge what happened to my sister, to say her life mattered." He paused, looking at Clint through tear-filled eyes. "Thank you for telling the truth. It can't bring her back, but it means the world to me." Clint swallowed hard, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm sorry, Matthew," he said quietly. "I should have done this years ago. I failed your sister and I failed you, but I promise I'll make sure her story is heard." Matthew nodded, his expression softening. "That's all I ask." When Laura published her expose, it sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. The article detailed Emily Dawson's tragic death, the systemic issues that contributed to it, and the efforts to silence those who tried to speak out. It included excerpts from Emily's journal, statements from former crew members like Daniel Harper, and Clint's heartfelt apology. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with reactions. Fans of Clint Eastwood were divided. Some criticized him for staying silent for so long, while others praised him for finally coming forward. Industry insiders began speaking out about similar experiences they'd witnessed or endured themselves. Producers, directors, and studio executives faced intense scrutiny over their practices, leading to calls for reform. People started using the hashtag #JusticeForEmily to share stories of unsafe working conditions and workplace harassment in the entertainment industry. The expose also caught the attention of lawmakers and advocacy groups. Congressional hearings were scheduled to address safety standards on film sets, and unions pushed for stricter regulations to protect workers. Emily's case became a rallying cry for change, inspiring countless individuals to demand better treatment and accountability. Despite the positive impact, the backlash was fierce. Powerful figures in Hollywood lashed out, accusing Laura of sensationalism and attempting to discredit her work. Some even tried to pressure Clint into retract, clearing his statement, offering him lucrative deals in exchange for silence, but Clint refused to budge. With Chuck's support, he stood firmly behind the story, knowing it was the right thing to do. "You think they'll ever forgive me?" Clint asked Chuck one night as they watched the news coverage together. Reporters were camped outside his home, eager for comments while talk shows debated his legacy. "Doesn't matter if they forgive you," Chuck replied. "What matters is that you forgave yourself. You faced your mistakes head-on, and that takes real courage." Clint smiled faintly, appreciating the sentiment. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that his reputation would never fully recover. And maybe that was okay. Redemption wasn't about reclaim things. It was about growth and learning from the past. As the weeks went by, the movement sparked by Emily's story continued to gain momentum. Matthew Dawson became an advocate for workplace safety, traveling across the country to speak at conferences and rallies. Inspired by his sister's bravery, he founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of workplace harassment and unsafe conditions. He credited Clint, Chuck, and Laura for giving him the strength to fight for justice. For Laura, the experience reinforced her belief in the power of journalism. Her expose earned her widespread recognition, including awards and accolades. But, more importantly, it reminded her why she had chosen this career: to give a voice to the voiceless and shine a light on the truth. Chuck returned to his ranch, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He had always admired Clint's toughness, but seeing him confront his vulnerabilities had deepened his respect for the man. Their friendship had grown stronger through the ordeal, proving that true bonds are forged in moments of honesty and vulnerability. And Clint, though vilified by some, he found peace in owning up to his mistakes. He began attending therapy sessions to process his guilt and grief, something he had avoided for years. Slowly but surely, he started rebuilding his relationship with himself and others. By honoring Emily's memory, he discovered a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, months after the exposé was published, Clint attended a memorial service organized by Matthew in Emily's honor. It was held in a small park near her hometown, surrounded by trees and flowers. Dozens of people gathered to pay their respects, including former crew members, activists, and fans who had been touched by her story. A plaque was unveiled in her name, inscribed with a quote from her journal: "Dream big, speak up, and never stop fighting for what's right." As Clint stood there listening to Matthew deliver a heartfelt speech, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile, a genuine, unguarded smile. He realized that while Emily's death had been tragic, her legacy was one of hope and resilience. Through her story, lives were being changed for the better. By the end of the service, Clint approached Matthew and hugged him tightly. "Your sister was extraordinary," he said. "She deserves every bit of this." Matthew nodded, tears in his eyes. "She would have loved seeing all this," he replied. "Thank you for helping keep her memory alive." As the sun set over the park, casting a warm golden glow, Clint felt a sense of closure wash over him. He still carried scars from the past, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of the lessons he had learned and the lives he had helped. In the end, the truth hadn't just shattered hearts, it had healed them, and that, Clint realized, was the greatest victory of all. Months had passed since the exposé about Emily Dawson's death shook Hollywood to its core. The ripple effects of the story continued to spread, touching lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. For Clint Eastwood, Chuck Norris, Laura Bennett, and Matthew Dawson, the journey had been transformative in ways they never anticipated. Each of them carried the weight of what they had uncovered, but also the hope that their actions would pave the way for a better future. Clint spent much of his time reflecting on the changes he had undergone. He no longer lived under the shadow of guilt, though reminders of Emily were everywhere, in his dreams, in conversations with strangers who recognized him, and in the letters he received from people inspired by her story. Some thanked him for his courage. Others criticized him for waiting so long to speak up. But Clint accepted both praise and criticism with grace, knowing he couldn't rewrite the past. What mattered now was how he used the lessons he had learned. He began volunteering at organizations dedicated to improving workplace safety in the entertainment industry. At first, it felt strange. Him, a legendary actor and director, sitting in meetings about regulations and protocols. But as he listened to workers share their concerns, he realized how much power he still held. His presence alone gave credibility to the cause, drawing attention to issues that might otherwise have been ignored. Slowly, he started finding joy, again, not in fame or fortune, but in making a difference. Chuck returned to his quiet life on the ranch, but he wasn't the same man who had left weeks earlier. The experience with Clint had reminded him of the importance of standing by those in need, even when it was uncomfortable. He began mentoring young filmmakers, sharing stories not just about action scenes and stunts, but about integrity and responsibility. Being strong isn't just about physical toughness, he often told them. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Laura, meanwhile, became a household name. Her exposé earned her awards and interviews on major networks, but she remained grounded. She knew the real heroes were people like Emily Dawson and Matthew, whose bravery had sparked change. Determined to keep the momentum going, Laura launched a series of investigative reports focusing on unsafe working conditions across various industries. She traveled across the country, interviewing factory workers, construction crews, and hospital staff, shining a light on injustices that had long been overlooked. Though the work was exhausting, it filled her with purpose. Matthew Dawson found solace in honoring his sister's memory. His nonprofit organization grew rapidly, attracting donations and volunteers from all over the world. He organized workshops, distributed educational materials, and partnered with unions to push for stricter safety laws. Despite the challenges, he felt closer to Emily than ever before. "She's here with me," he often said during speeches. "In every voice that speaks up, in every worker who feels safer because of what we've done." The impact of Emily's story extended far beyond personal transformations. It ignited a movement that spread across industries, forcing companies to reevaluate their practices. Film studios implemented new safety measures, hiring independent inspectors to ensure compliance. Workers were encouraged to report hazards without fear of retaliation, and training programs became mandatory for everyone on set. Similar reforms took root in other fields from manufacturing to healthcare, as people rallied behind the slogan, "Not justice for Emily." But perhaps the most profound change came in the form of cultural shifts. Conversations about workplace safety and accountability entered mainstream discourse, challenging long-held attitudes about sacrifice and ambition. People began asking tough questions. Why had these problems persisted for so long? Who benefited from ignoring them? And what could be done to prevent future tragedies? For many, the answers lay in collective action. Grassroots campaigns sprang up, led by ordinary individuals determined to make a difference. They organized protests, circulated petitions, and lobbied lawmakers for stronger protections. Their efforts paid off. New legislation was introduced, holding employers accountable for negligence and misconduct. While progress was slow, the tide was turning. One evening, several months after the memorial service, Clint invited Chuck, Laura, and Matthew to his home in Los Angeles. It was a rare gathering, one meant to celebrate how far they had come while acknowledging the road ahead. The house was warm and inviting, decorated with photographs and mementos from Clint's career. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow over the living room. As they sat together, sipping coffee and reminiscing about the events that had brought them here, Clint raised his cup in a toast. "To Emily," he said, his voice steady. "Her courage changed us all." "To Emily," the others echoed, clinking their cups gently. Matthew smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. "I think she'd be proud of what we've done," he said softly. "Not just the changes we've made, but the way we've stood together." Laura nodded, leaning forward in her chair. "And there's still so much more to do. This is just the beginning." Chuck chuckled, his deep voice breaking the solemn mood. "Well, if anyone can handle it, it's you three." He looked at each of them in turn, his expression warm. "You've shown incredible strength. I'm honored to call you friends." The group laughed, the tension easing as they shared lighter moments. They talked about their plans for the future, Clint's upcoming projects, Laura's next investigation, Matthew's growing nonprofit. There was optimism in the air, a sense that they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it. As the night wore on, Clint stepped outside onto the patio, gazing up at the stars. The sky was clear, dotted with pinpricks of light that seemed endless. He thought about Emily, wondering if she was watching over them somehow. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "For giving me a second chance?" Back inside, Chuck joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You ready for whatever comes next?" he asked. Clint nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, as long as we face it together." Together. That single word summed up everything they had learned. The power of unity, the strength found in vulnerability, and the belief that even in darkness, light could prevail. Emily Dawson's story had shattered hearts, yes, but it had also mended them, proving that truth and justice could heal wounds once thought irreparable. And so, as the night stretched on and the fire burned low, they sat in comfortable silence, grateful for the bond they shared and hopeful for the days ahead. Whatever challenges lay in store, they knew they wouldn't face them alone. After all, they had already proven that when people stand together, anything is possible.